Welcome back to Everard Junction. In today's video we're going to be focusing an awful lot of attention over the new Dapol Class 59. This is a model that I've been waiting for many years, and it presents good value and an excellent basis for a detailing project. Over the course of the video I'll be tackling improving the colour temperature and configuration of the headlights, adding figures to the cab as well as improving the colour temperature of the cab lighting, realignment of the cab doors and gluing them shut, painting the pickups so they blend in and disappear from view, modifying the radio pods so they are correct for the model, changing the height of the exhaust, repainting the upper blue stripe to the correct thickness, and finally some very gentle, subtle weathering using photographs as reference to reflect the locomotive's new condition for 1990. The Class 59 came into service in 1986. It was notable at the time, being the first privately owned locomotive to run on British Rail tracks. Between 1985 and 1995, a total of 15 of these locomotives were built over a series of small batches. The first company to explore the idea of owning their locomotives was Foster Yeoman, one of Europe's largest quarrying companies at the time. In the UK, they transported huge quantities of limestone from Tor Works in Somerset. In 1986, the company moved 6 million tonnes of material. Whether the product was to be used internally in the UK or shipped internationally, its transportation usually involved rail. Foster Yeoman was one of British Rail's largest customers, and they depended on British Rail to deliver the limestone and other products to market. One of the challenges faced by Yeoman was the value of their product. In fact, it was one of the lowest value bulk materials transported by British Rail. As such, Yeoman's operations were very sensitive and heavily depended on bulk transportation with the minimum of delays or fuss. Coupled to this, the trains themselves were some of the heaviest in the UK, composing of various wagon types from British Rail themselves or newer types privately owned by Foster Yeoman. British Rail had two locomotives in the power range for these heavy trains. The Class 56, which was designed in the late 70s, and the much newer Class 58, which was designed in the early 80s, having only recently come into service. Despite being one of my personal favourites, the Class 58 was few in number, and many of the class were still in production at Doncaster Works. 58s were being allocated to the coal workings of the Midlands, with the entire fleet being allocated to Toton Depot. The class had a tendency to suffer from wheel slip in adverse weather, even with light to moderate loads, and despite their superb reliability, ease of maintenance and superior cab comfort, the class were not available and not suited to Yeoman's extremely heavy, demanding trains. Instead, British Rail provided the Class 56, a class with high power and decent tractive effort, not suffering from wheel slip problems anywhere near as badly as the Class 58. The Class 56. It was a hastily designed locomotive that was rushed into service during the late 1970s as a result of the oil crisis. It suffered from appalling reliability and challenging maintenance. In 1983, 40% of the Yeoman services were arriving late behind Class 56s, and some of them never arriving at all. Class 56s based at Cardiff had a reliability target of 9,000 miles between a breakdown. Now this could be something as serious as an engine crankshaft failing or something as trivial as a speedometer not working, but whatever it might be, it still takes the locomotive out of service for a time. So 9,000 miles was the target. While this number seems very easy, the reality was that the 56s could barely achieve it. 4,000 miles was a much more realistic number, and it took years for determined BR technicians and crew to achieve the 9,000 mile target. 125 Class 56s were built, and this ultimately saved their somewhat flawed design. Several examples continue in service today after receiving numerous modifications and fixes over the course of the last 30 years. Back to the 1980s, and Yeoman needed a better alternative to the Class 56. The answer came from EMD in the form of the Class 59. Various builders were approached, but they were not interested in designing a locomotive for such a small order, with Yeoman initially only requiring 4 locomotives for their fleet. EMD stepped up to the plate and scaled down existing proven technology from their existing catalogue. They then bolted all of this technology into a locomotive body capable of operating in the UK. Many of the cab features were carried over from the, at the time new, Class 58, so that British Rail crews were somewhat familiar with operating the class. Having previously been trained on the Class 58, you would have found some similarities in the Class 59, and this would have made operation a little bit easier and a little bit quicker. After arriving in the UK and being inspected and performing a few trials, the 59s started operating trains for Yeoman in February 1986. During their first year of operation, these first 4 locomotives built for Foster Yeoman travelled an average of 270,000 miles. They hauled 2,840,000 tonnes of material with an availability of 99%. Over the course of the following decade, these 4 locomotives achieved an even higher availability of 99.8%. Towards the late 80s and moving into the 1990s, additional companies in the form of ARC and National Power acquired their own small fleet of Class 59s with similar levels of success. Today, the Class 59s continue to perform the roles they were originally built for. Some examples are now over 35 years old, and yet they can still be found in places like Westbury hauling heavy stone trains. After acquiring its initial 4 locomotives from EMD, business for Yeoman boomed, and they found themselves frequently having to hire in a Class 56 from British Rail to keep up with their growing customer demands. In 1988, they ordered a 5th loco from EMD, and this locomotive is the subject of today's video, arriving to the British network in the summer of 1989. So here we have the new model from Dapol. I've been waiting 7 years for this to turn up, so I'm really pleased to have it on the layout. And I've just removed the body shell, the cab interior, which is held in with a couple of clips, so we can fit a decoder and start the process of making a few changes and improvements. The first thing I would like to tackle is the lighting. Its configuration is not correct for the real thing. This particular 59 represents the last of the earlier style that were manufactured for Foster Yeoman. They have quite a distinctive front end with 4 large headlights and 2 tail lights. These lights have 2 configurations on the switch panel in the cab. The most common setup is to have all 4 of those lights lit, and this is how you would normally operate the locomotive in service with a train. The second configuration, and a little bit more rare to spot, is the markers only setting, which is used when the locomotive is pottering around at slow speed in a yard doing a bit of shunting. Unfortunately, the model has a rather strange lighting configuration that basically restricts you to having 2 of these forward headlights lit at any one time, when in reality it should be all 4. The model does feature the yard mode, where there is the 2 marker lights lit and the headlights extinguished, which is nice to see. However, the headlight mode, which is the most commonly used mode for most people running this on their model railways, restricts operation to just a single marker and a single headlight illuminated. You can press a button to flip these from one side to the other, but you cannot get all 4 lights to stay lit. While it looks like both of the headlights are lit in this photograph, the reality is they're not. It is simply light bleed going into the other light lens, giving the illusion that both of the lights are lit. In reality, on the circuit board underneath, only 2 LEDs are being turned on. This has caused a bit of head scratching amongst the community, as myself and various other people have attempted to try and solve this with different types of decoder. I'll spare you the details, but it got relatively complicated quite quickly, and before I knew it, I was learning how to use Swiss mapping on Zimo decoders using a PC interface. Despite getting to grips with that and learning a lot more about decoder programming, I didn't have any luck in getting the lights to work properly. I tried various decoders from the likes of Zimo, ESU, and even Dapol's own Imperium decoder with no success. The circuit board in the Dapol 59 contains additional microcontrollers that you have no control over. These ultimately cause certain lighting configurations to just not be possible. As a workaround, I've performed a small bit of soldering to the lighting board at either end of the loco. By soldering the blue and black wire together at both ends of the loco, you effectively make the headlights one circuit, and then when they are sent a signal to turn one of them on, what actually happens now is both of them turn on. The same is true for the markers at the sides of the locomotive. By soldering together the white and the yellow wire, you make those two LEDs one circuit, and then if one of those LEDs is sent a command to switch on, then both switch on. This results in the locomotive now having the correct lighting configuration with all four of those large lights illuminated when hauling a train, while preserving the additional functionality such as being able to turn off the headlights, switch to yard mode and use the cab lights. It took me a while to come to this conclusion and quite a bit of head scratching, but I'm really pleased with the results. You don't have to be an enthusiast or nerd to understand that all four of those lights should probably be lit when the locomotive is in operation. If you are in doubt, looking at one picture tells you everything you need to know. While I had the model apart, I took some of the trusty Tamiya X26 clear orange paint and I used this to tint the LEDs and give them a more realistic colour temperature for how these things look. The LEDs fitted to the model are a very piercing white tone, almost blue in their colour temperature. This is true for other models such as the Realtrack 156 and in my opinion can spoil the front end appearance of the model when it's running around the layout. A couple of coats of the clear orange paint, including some on the cab light, which was also very blue in its colour temperature, has yielded a much more sort of pleasant looking result, and I'm quite happy with how it looks now. The cab interior, this is held on with two small clips into the side of the cab window glazing in a similar manner to a Bachmann Class 47. So if you've taken the interior out of one of those, you won't have a problem doing this one. I've taken that out so we can fit some figures to the cab, something I always like to do to my locomotives. I've got a selection of 3D printed figures from fine scale figures currently in progress. Certainly take a while to paint, but they're very effective. And I found this chap sitting down in a shirt and tie, and he looks a little bit like he might be found in the cab of a locomotive. So I've painted him accordingly, and we'll put him in the driver's seat. I've also got this chap who's in a full suit, and we'll put him in the second man's seat. This particular loco is 59005, which was brand new in 1989. So during the time my layout is set, it was likely to have seen this locomotive doing some of its very first runs, and there would have been various suits present in the cab during that time to make sure everything was working properly with their new purchase. Obviously painting these figures is a little bit tricky and basically impossible to film, but generally speaking, take your time. Use a nice small brush, and for these particular figures I've used a selection of the Ammo and Vallejo acrylic paints, which work really well for this sort of thing. The cab interior of the 59 is not modelled in full relief, so these guys are going to have some slight amputation to get them to fit, but once it's all glued in, I think it will look effective. I've just used a small amount of rocket card glue to fix these figures to the seats in the cab, and now we'll take a little bit of oil paint and just give them a quick wash to highlight some of the detail. As they're 3D printed, there's lots of really good detail on these figures, and then we can move on to the next job. I've used some of this 502 Abteilung oil colour, specifically the engine grease, which is basically a very dark brown, and that just adds a little bit of highlight and shadowing to some of the figures. It will take ages to dry, being oil paint, and once it has dried, I'll give it a quick coat of matte varnish just to take some of the shine off it. Okay, there's the figures reinstalled back inside the cab, and you can see, as I always say, just how much of a difference it makes. Class 59's got quite big windows, so they're even more obvious, so the model certainly looks a little bit strange when there's nobody sitting at the controls. Large side windows too, so once again the figures can be easily seen, and I'm quite pleased with the effect. While I've got the body off, I'm going to look at another little thing that I want to try and improve, and that is the exhaust silencer.
Now it's a nice model of the exhaust silencer, but it's sitting quite high up in the body shell, more like the position you would find it in a Class 66. The 59s, the exhaust silencer is quite a bit lower down. As you can see, the edge of the exhaust silencer here is sticking above the height of that slope in the roof of the body, and this is not noticeable on the real thing because the whole silencer is sitting much lower down. So I'm going to look at a couple of pictures and see if there's anything we can do to try and improve that. Silencer just pops off the roof of the model real easy. No glues used in holding it on, probably because you need to get access to the smoke unit that certain versions of this model are available with. This is a non-smoke version. I certainly didn't see the need for the smoke unit version of this model. In real life, Class 59s don't really smoke, especially when they're up to temperature. So light the cab doors, bit of an odd choice. I'm left somewhat baffled, but anyway, at least it's easy to get the silencer off, and now we'll see if we can make some improvements. Okay, so using a very sharp knife, I have cut all of the lugs off the side of the main silencer, and I've also cut off the manifold from the engine. So now we've just got this bit, the silencer itself, and I can just sand that until it's the right sort of height. So literally just, you can see the bottom of it there, how it's made. We'll just literally keep sanding it and offer it up to the body shell several times until it sits in the right place. At least judging it by eye using the photos that I've got at my disposal here. So I've ended up filing a couple of millimeters off the bottom of this silencer, which is, as you can see, sunk it down into the body shell considerably. Initially I thought this section, the manifold, was correct, but looking at pictures that also looked like it was sitting a tad too high, so I have done a bit of filing on that, but not quite so much. So I just continue to just take little bits off it and smooth it out and work it down until it matched as closely as I can tell by just doing it by eye the pictures that I have here at my disposal. Certainly now it looks a much more like a Class 59. Of course it won't be in 100% accurate position because I've done it by eye, but I've got as close as I can, and it certainly looks better than the model did when it's out of the box. There'll be a few little touch-ups and extra bits and pieces to just tidy this up, but for the most part I'm happy with it, and I'll do that as part of the weathering process for the locomotive. So now it's time to apply the etched names and numbers, nice little detail which really give a bit of extra life and realism to the model. And to do this, most of the time I just use a very small amount of rocket card glue, but you can also use things like perhaps a matte or satin varnish. Basically you just want a very small amount of whatever it is you've chosen on the printed number just there, and then you can place the etched plate over the top without fear of whatever it is spewing out from the sides and ruining the appearance of the model. If you are attempting this, don't use superglue, as usually things go wrong when superglue is involved in precision jobs. With the exhaust now sorted, it's now time to turn my attention to the radio pods. 59005 was delivered with a pair of radio pods, unlike the first four, which were delivered without them and later received them as a modification. To their credit, Dapol have just about put them in the correct place. You've got one here just ahead of the exhaust, and then there's one back here. Now this one is absolutely correct. You can see that the top of the body shell, or the peak of the body shell, has been flatted off, and the radio pod, which looks a little bit like a small drain, is just sort of sitting there on top. At this end it's in the correct place, but it's not quite right. The radio pod itself is correct, but it's sitting on this little brass plinth that's clipped into the roof of the model. In reality, the roof has a sort of cutout in this area, with the grille being set further down in a similar manner to how it is down this end of the loco. Now, I'm sure most people who've got one of these will just leave this detail alone, and I completely understand, and I probably would have done myself had I not noticed that it's slightly incorrect on the model. It's just one of those things. Once you know, and it's just gonna draw my eye every time I look at it, knowing that radio pod isn't quite right. I've prized the pod off of the roof with a small screwdriver. It is glued into position, and it is quite tricky to get it to pop free from the body without causing damage. You can see on the inside of the etch little platform that the pod has just got two little lugs on it, and it's just glued into place. I of course will need to reuse the detail and place it back onto the roof after I have modified it to the correct style for 59005. Hopefully you can see there I have filed a section off the roof, just used a couple of files from Expo, and just took my time, made sure we didn't file off too much material. There you can see the radio pod back into position. I think I need to file just a little bit more material off so that we get the edge of the radio pod to line up perfectly with the edge of the material that I have sanded away. And of course there's those two small holes left over from the etch, which also need filling in. I'll continue to refine the shape of this, looking at as many photographs as possible that I can find of 59005. I've got a couple really good overhead shots and a couple of videos where it's possible to pause just at the right moment and get a really good look at this area on the real locomotive. So I'll do my best by looking at those images and just sort of working carefully. A little bit more filing and adjustment here and there. Once again, looking at pictures to try and get this thing as accurate as I can. And I think we're about there. The next step is to fill in the two holes left behind by the plinth that was previously in this location, and to do that I'll just be using a bit of putty. I'm going to use some of this perfect plastic putty from Deluxe Materials. Never used it before, but it looks like it'll do the job. It's got a picture of a train on it, so it must be alright. So there it is, with the radio pod glued back into position. And looking at the photos, I'd say I've got reasonably close to how it's portrayed on the real loco. It was certainly more accurate than where we started. I've filled in the two holes either side for that small etched piece and sanded those smooth with a little bit of fine sandpaper. So now it's time just to get the airbrush out and blow this area back in to blend in the paintwork. For a quick first pass with the airbrush, I am quite impressed with the colour match so far. I was expecting to have to mix things up and try different stuff out, but it looks like the factory finish on the model is quite close to Humbrol number 11. Now, of course, I'm using a really old tin of Humbrol number 11, so I couldn't comment as to whether the modern tin of paint is the same quality, the same standard of finish, but this is working really well for this model, so I'm going to stick with it. I've had this tin for many years, and I tend to find it's my best silver in terms of finish, and I use it all the time for little bits and pieces. One of the features of this new model is opening cab doors. Opening cab doors have somewhat become a thing of the past, with most manufacturers now avoiding it. This is because they usually don't fit particularly well, and the shut line around the outside of the door can be quite large and ill-fitting. As you can see on this example, the door doesn't quite line up as well as it should. For that reason, I'm not a fan of opening cab doors. However, I know some people are a fan of opening cab doors and love nothing more than positioning the door in the fully open position as if a driver's on a hot day and he's trying to keep things cool in the cab, or perhaps you've got a large TMD or yard-based layout and you want to portray the shunter hanging out of the loco providing instructions to the driver.
So let's say, for example, we do want to make use of this feature and open the cab doors and position a figure inside. Well, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed because, yeah, that's it. That's as far as they open. So there you have it, a completely pointless feature. I'm going to remove the spring loading mechanism from these doors and refit them to the model and glue them shut. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to improve the alignment by getting them to sit parallel to the body side, something a little bit like that, and then glue them back into position. Hopefully that might improve some of the poor alignment with the blue banding that runs around the locomotive. I've taken the door out at this end and it's difficult to see obviously, but basically the chassis block of the loco is right there, so obviously the door has no chance of opening even halfway. It's going to hit the chassis block. So basically what I have done is I have completely removed the opening door mechanism from the doors themselves. You can see there's a metal pin there with a small spring attached to it, a piece of plastic which slots into the body shell of the loco, and then that whole assembly hangs the door and allows it to swing open. Inside the model you can see this little sort of bit of C-channel here, this little groove. That's where this mechanism slides into position, and then the little rod with the spring on it runs through that door hinge just there. That's part of the door itself. As you can see, I've put a small blob of super glue on those hinges, which allows the door to sit as flush as possible to the body side, and then just gently lifting the door up and down in the aperture and sort of opening and closing it very slightly to achieve the best possible alignment, and then leaving it for the super glue to set. You can see to the right of the door here how there is a gap between the door and the body side. If this was left as per factory with the door mechanism, the spring would snap that door shut against the body side, and then this door wouldn't be parallel with the body when you look from the outside. And there hopefully you can see how the door is now sitting nice and parallel with the side of the body on the locomotive. You can also see where some of the blue paint hasn't managed to get around where you would step in, so I'll be mixing up a little bit of blue paint and touching that up on all four doors. Certainly an improvement. It will never be perfect, but it does look better, at least on my example, with these doors now glued into position. As I said previously, I'll do my best with a little bit of blue paint just to touch things up and better hide some of the errors. So with quite a lot of the work now finished, it's now time to put the body back onto the locomotive. This is one of the real nice things with this loco. There's just a couple of clips and there's no screws or anything like that. And the body quite literally snaps into place. That is a nice feature. We've got all of the headlights lit up there, and that Tamiya clear orange has done a lovely job of toning the sort of colour temperature down to the sort of more yellowy sort of orange range that's a bit more realistic for one of these locos. I can set the brightness of the LEDs within the decoder settings, so I'll mess around with that and get something reasonably close to how they would have been in real life. Very often locos have quite bright lighting, and typically with a lot of my locos I'll try and turn it down where possible. So as we can see, we've got forward and reverse. I have the option to turn off the tail lights when it's hitched up to a train. That's a nice feature. We've also got directional cab lights which can be switched on and off, and once again I've taken the Tamiya clear orange to the LED inside the cabs, as the cabs had a real blue sort of tinge to them. If you look in this photograph when I first took delivery of the model, you can see how the cab looks very sort of blue in terms of colour temperature, and I think now we're looking quite a bit better with that sort of yellow sort of fluorescent tinge that these real locos are associated with. I have turned down the sound a little bit, but it does sound good with that EM1 speaker. There's a selection of different horns. This is my favourite. A nice sort of cheeky short horn. That's quite good. There's also this silly one. Plus your traditional low and high tone horns. There's also various other sounds, such as the compressor, which cuts in and out automatically. That's the noise that's playing just now. That'll shut up in a second. There you go. There's also the cab doors. Kind of pointless now because I've glued those shut. But a decent suite of sounds and plenty of options on the sound package from Roads and Rails. The braking sounds also play correctly as you drive the locomotive, and another nice feature, the cab light turns off when the locomotive sets off, which is again what you would do in real life after perhaps pausing and doing a signal check or going for a bit of paperwork or whatever, and then eventually you get the go ahead to get going. You increase power, turn the cab light off, and away you go.
So before tackling the weathering, the next job to do is a job that, to be honest, I nearly didn't bother with, but considering we're taking it this far and we're trying to sort out as many little things as possible, we're going to take the plunge and we're going to sort this bit out as well. So around the top of the locomotive there is this blue stripe with the yeoman text over the radiator grills. Unfortunately, on the model it is too thin. So looking at the roof, there's a bend just there, and then the sheet metal comes down here. Another subtle bend just there, flat sheet metal comes down to here, then another bend, sheet metal comes all the way down to the cab window, and then there's another final bend, or probably in this case there'd be some sort of a joint or a weld, and then the body side extends down the locomotive. When the real things were painted, the blue stripe was masked off along the bend here and the bend or weld or joint here. So as you can see, the stripe on the model as we have it now is too thin. Another reason for going ahead with this is looking at the cab doors. Even though I've glued them to the best of my ability back in a straight position, the paintwork, certainly at the top of the doors, does not line up with the existing stripe on the body side, as you can see here, and on many of the doors the stripe is thicker than it is on the body shell, and it just makes things look a little bit spoiled and clumsy. So here we are back at the spray booth. I've masked up the model best I can. I have masked over the yeoman section of the stripe, and I will deal with that separately with brushes later on, because obviously I don't want to overpaint the yeoman text itself.
So, using two different colours, Network Southeast Dark Blue and Network Southeast Light Blue from Phoenix Precision, I've mixed up a strange shade of blue on this spray up card, offered it up to the locomotive and kept messing about with it until I got a nice colour that matched both the bits of the stripe I've not repainted up top where the yeoman text is, and also the stripe at the bottom of the loco which I've not touched. So it's now the following day. I've left the model overnight to dry. That blue stripe was a little bit tricky to spray, and I didn't want to do any more work to the model until I was sure that all of that had completely dried. I've just gone around it and touched up a couple of little bits that I needed to do. Nothing too major, but there's always going to be a little bit of imperfection when trying to paint over an existing paint job on a factory fresh model. To do that, I've used a little bit of the enamel thinner and a cocktail stick, and when you paint over a factory paint job, especially something like this that's silver and quite shiny and smooth in its appearance, the blue paint that I've put on isn't exactly going to be stuck super well, so with a little bit of effort you can get some of it to lift and come off. So in the case of where there was a little bit of paint bleed down on the doors, and there was a little bit of paint bleed onto the rain gutter that runs over the cab windows, you can literally just put a little bit of that enamel thinner on the end of the cocktail stick and just gently scratch away at the paint that you want to remove, and it will just literally fall off, and you can neaten up edges and straighten things up and fix errors and mistakes. I've also added a small amount of that same blue mix of paint to the Yeoman Y logo, as in a couple of the recesses on the corrugated sides of the logo this had not covered properly when it was sprayed in the factory. The one on the other side is fine, nothing wrong with it, but on this side there were a few white bits showing through, so I've touched all that up as well. I've masked off the top of the logo just there, and we're just going to blow in that very small silver rectangle with some white paint just to help the eye. When you look at the side of the model, everything should look straight and line up in the correct place. For the weathering process, the first thing I shall tackle is the wheels. The bogies on this model are very difficult to dismantle and even more difficult to put back together. So to paint the wheels, I'm just using a rolling road from DCC Concepts, and we can just put a brush on the face of the wheel just there and let the model do the work. Something else that you'll notice from the box on one of these models is the pickup bar is very visible. It's a bright, shiny piece of metal that runs the length of the bogie to collect the current needed for the model to run. I've painted this black so it blends into the background and disappears into the bogie, as it was particularly noticeable from various angles. And to do that, I just worked very carefully with a small brush and some Vallejo matte black paint. With the wheels now painted, it's time to turn my attention to the last little job, and that is to do a very small amount of weathering. Now, of course, Yeoman really looked after these things and had a lot of pride in them, so they were generally kept very clean. Using pictures of 59005 in 1990, I shall be doing my best to portray the condition in those photographs to this model here. I'll be using rail match paints, specifically sleeper grime, roof dirt and matte black. The weathering will be very gentle and very subtle, focusing on real photographs of the real thing. That completes the model. It's been a long road. It's taken several evenings over the course of several weeks. It certainly turned into a bit more of a project than I was intending it to, but I'm very pleased with the results. Perhaps the biggest win was the alteration to the lighting to make it correct for a Class 59.0. As you can probably gather, even if you're not an enthusiast, not having one of those lights at the front lit up would look quite odd with the locomotive running around the layout, even if you're not an expert. The piercing blue-white tints that they had originally also didn't do them any favours, and I think the model looks much more sort of sympathetic and realistic to the real thing, with a much more gentle sort of bulb-looking lighting system rather than piercing LEDs. As you can see, I've gone very carefully with the weathering, and this is about as close as my skills will allow me to get to how this thing really did look in 1990. As you can see, I've done a very subtle weathering over the bogies, battery boxes and fuel tanks. There's a little bit of dirt on the front valance, but nothing too crazy, and a small little bit of exhaust dirt that just breaks over onto that modified radio pod, which is also realistic and has the benefit of hiding any slightly shoddy edges from my conversion work. It has at times been a bit challenging and a bit frustrating, but on the whole I've enjoyed the project, and it's been nice, to get the paints and the tools and everything out and just settle in to a nice bit of modelling. While it would be very easy to criticise Dapol and get all hung up on the various issues the model has, at the end of the day it's well priced in today's market, and it provides an excellent basis for doing the work that I have done here. You can either decide to do it, or you can decide that the model is perfectly alright out of the box and leave it as is. So let's get this thing up and running. I'll leave you with a few running shots as always, and I'll be back as soon as I can when I've made enough progress on the next project.